I'm Scott Kennedy. I'm the Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS, and I'm delighted to join you, to have you all join us today for this book forum on Ian Johnson's latest book, The Souls of China. I want to make a few opening remarks and then turn the floor over to Ian, the author, and then we'll sit down back in these comfortable chairs. I'll pepper him with a couple tough, hard reporter line questions, and then open the floor to you all for the rest of the program. I've known Ian now. I was doing the math this morning, and not being an economist by training, but by practice and pretend. It's been 19 years that we've known each other. And I met Ian in the late 1990s when I was doing my dissertation research in China. At that time, he was working for the Wall Street Journal, and I was still trying to find my way around China to do research and interviews. And Ian, like he's done in so many ways, was extremely helpful in getting me started on that path. And just last week, I was communicating with one of the people that he originally introduced me to 19 years ago. And so Ian's been very important in my professional life as well as a close friend. Ian's, as you know, a reporter, a commentator. I also think of Ian as a historian and an anthropologist. And if you read his work, whether it's in the long form of a book or the short form of an essay, I think you'd agree. He's written for the Baltimore Sun, the Wall Street Journal for several years, and now he's a contributor to the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, as well as the National Geographic and other publications. In addition to that, he's a fellow with Merrick's, which is one of, I think, the best think tank in Europe that focuses on contemporary China. He's written two other books, Wild Grass, which came out in 2004, and A Mosque in Munich, which was published in 2010. He's won several awards, amongst them the 2001 Pulitzer for when he was at the Journal, the Wall Street Journal, and writing not about business issues that you would think the Journal would have you write about, but about more important issues then. I think a lot of the stories were about Falun Gong practitioners and others, and a lot of that ended up in Wild Grass. He, this year, it was just announced that he's the 2017 recipient of the Shorenstein Award for the body of his work on Asia over the course of his career. As I said, from a professional point of view, he wears many hats. But I'd like to also think of him just as a writer. And when you read his work, it is genuinely, you feel like you're reading literature. They talk about the academic literature, the career that I participated in for 14 plus years, not literature. Ian's work, literature. He's also a risk taker. To do the reporting that he does, the writing that he does, he has to take plenty of risks. I'll just tell you one story, not about Ian, but I think it's relevant. I had a friend of mine who was doing research on house churches in China, and when he went to villages to look at house churches, he stuck out horribly. He was way bigger than everybody. And anyway, he was relaxing once. He had done a lot of field work and was relaxing on the beach in Xiamen in Fujian province with his feet dangling in the water. And these two young ladies walked up to him and introduced themselves, and he was thinking, oh, this is really great. I can relax and I'm having fun meeting people. And they just talked about things, not about any of the work he did or where he went to school in China, but just, what life was like. And they said goodbye. One said, oh, can I have my picture with you? So she put his arm around him, got a nice photograph, and they parted, and that was it. Lo and behold, several weeks later, my friend got back to the school where he was studying, and there was a letter in his box, in his mailbox, and he opened the envelope, and inside it was this photograph of him with this girl. And he thought, how in the heck did they know where I live? And I refer to those ladies as big brothers, little sisters. They are the ones who were aware of the type of work that he was doing. And my friend was just a student, academic, right? He didn't work for the most important paper on the planet. And so where Ian is a representative of the finest journalism in the world, and that means that he receives a lot more attention than just about any of us. And so that is a huge challenge for him and others in his profession in China. And lastly, besides being a risk taker, I just wanted to mention how valuable Ian is, his writing. And he's valuable not just to us, because he helps interpret China for us. He's valuable to Chinese people. There's not many people in China who can write about the topics that he writes about with the clarity, the transparency, the frankness that he does. He's not telling the official story. He's not telling just Ian's story or an outsider's story. He's telling the stories of the lives of these people from their perspectives. And I think he does a wonderful job of finding that crucial line between empathy and sympathy, where he tells their story that's not his. And I think that's truly important for people in China, beside the benefits that we get from his work. We're super delighted that you're here. We're super delighted that you've put together this book. We look forward to your presentation today and the discussion. So everyone, please welcome me and join me in welcoming Ian Johnson.
Scott was talking about all the risks that I took, and a lot of the time I spent, you think of writing a book on spiritual pursuits, that you're going to be meditating in a cave, or you'll become a vegetarian, or something like that. A lot of the people I was hanging out with were working class pilgrims in Beijing and other cities, and I think the biggest risk was probably to my lungs and my liver from drinking baijiu and smoking cigarettes with them. But anyway, we can get to that later. Up on the screen behind you are simply some pictures that I think are rotating through of people I met and scenes of religious life in Beijing. It's not timed specifically to my talk or anything like that. And they'll sort of just change every couple of minutes, I think. Although that is a very famous pastor who's written a history of Christianity in China, and who I visited for the book. So I want to talk a little bit about how I got interested in this book, why the topic I think is important, and also because we're in Washington, I want to put a little bit of focus on politics, on Xi Jinping, and some of the policy implications that this has, because this is, of course, now we think of Xi Jinping maybe as being a relatively new leader, but he's already almost halfway through his official term of 10 years. He took power in 2012, and this coming autumn he'll be reappointed to another 5-year term, almost certainly. So it's worth thinking of this also in the context of domestic Chinese politics, and as one of the most important things facing, or that Xi has taken as an issue to solve. One of the, you may think, well, why would this be an important issue for Xi? And I think to sort of to explain this, I want to go back and talk about why religion matters in China. To some degree, it should be obvious. If we think of our own countries, if you think of the United States, you would not really be able to credibly talk about U.S. politics or history if you didn't know anything about the Puritans, if you didn't know the faith of Martin Luther King Jr., if you didn't know the role of the Southern Baptists. Nobody would take you seriously if you wanted to write or talk about politics. By the same token, I think, and it's maybe a little more counterintuitive in the case of China, but religion, faith, values have actually been at the center of Chinese society and the turmoil in Chinese society over the past 100 or so years. And it's still an issue today, and this is why Xi Jinping has taken it up as one of his key domestic policy issues. And I say this is a bit counterintuitive because our image of Chinese cities, or China probably, is not really defined by religion. If we travel to China, we don't see cities that have great religious sites overall. Of course, yes, if you go to the Temple of Heaven in Beijing or someplace like that, you'll see beautiful religious sites. But overall, if you travel through Chinese cities, they seem almost devoid of religion, stripped of any sign of religion. It's especially noticeable if you spend time in Taiwan or even Hong Kong, where, say, in Taipei, there are temples almost on every block or two, and on the street corners, there'll be little shrines. And you'd think, perhaps you might, if you go to Beijing, you might think, well, it's a regional difference. Taipei, Taiwan, and Beijing are far apart, a northern city and a southern city. But it's interesting to think that up until the early 20th century, Beijing had over 1,000 temples. And this has been wonderfully documented by a Princeton historian, Susan Nequin, who wrote a book called Beijing, Its Temples, something like 1500 to 1900. She just does an incredible survey of the temple life in Beijing. So then when you think of it like that and you look at Beijing, and sure, there are some temples. You can think of the Lama Temple and other temples like that, but there aren't that many. There may be, at the maximum in a city of 20-odd million people, just maybe, 30 or 40 functioning temples. And you compare what was there a century ago, you wonder then what happened? Where did all the temples go? Where did the religious infrastructure go? And the answer is that China, not uniquely, but maybe uniquely in terms of the scope and the ferocity, China had a wave of anti-religious attacks that started in the late 19th century, actually, well predating the communists. So we often think of this, maybe it's the atheist communists attacking religion. This is certainly part of the story, but it's not the whole story. The story began with a profound unease and doubting of Chinese civilization and culture, starting with, really with the Opium Wars and China losing war after war against the West, the humiliations of the 19th century. And by the end of the 19th century, people thought China doesn't just need a new emperor or a new dynasty, it needs to get rid of the entire system that runs the country. And this meant attacking religion, because religion and politics were intertwined in traditional Chinese society. There was really no way to separate the two out. The emperor was the son of heaven. Officials in China were legitimized by religious rites that they carried out, for example, at city god temples across the country. So when reformers wanted to go after the political system, they also went after the religious system, the religious political system. You can see this symbolically in people like Sun Yat-sen. One of the first acts of rebellion he did as a young man in Guangdong province was to go to the local temple with a stick and smash the statues of the gods in the temple. So I'm getting rid of all this stuff. And many of the reformers early on in the 20th century converted to other religions like Christianity. Chiang Kai-shek, for example, probably mainly under the influence of his wife. It's debatable how much of a practicing Christian he was, but he did actually convert to Christianity. So this was something, as I said, it predates even the end of the emperor. The reformer in the late 19th century, Kang Youwei, started the 100 days of reform. It was unsuccessful, but one of the slogans, one of the policies was convert temples to schools, miao gai xiao. And this was The idea that we don't need all these temples and religion and stuff like that. We need schools, we need education, we need to be able to compete with the West, stand up to the West, and we need to get rid of all of this traditional stuff that's holding us back. This is not unique to China. In other countries that were also facing crises of modernity in the 20th century had similar reactions. Countries like Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, when it collapsed, the reformers under Ataturk undertook a radical course of secularization. Mosques were closed, converted to museums. They abolished the caliphate, which was the ruler of Muslims, or supposedly the rulers of all Muslims. And even in, after World War II, the Ba'ath Party in Syria and in Iraq, initially, it's hard to think of this, to remember this now, but early on was a radically secularizing movement that was opposed to religion, thought Islam was holding back these parts of the world, holding back their countries. But China, maybe because the experience was so strong, the challenge was so great, the attacks were extremely fierce. There was an estimate by the French sinologist Vincent Gossard that there were roughly, and this is a real guesstimate, and it's probably understating the number, but there were roughly 1 million temples at the end of the 19th century. By the middle of the 20th century, he estimates that half of those temples had been destroyed or put to other use. And when the communists took power, they were in this tradition of seeing religion as a problem like gambling, opium, prostitution. Chinese religion was a social ill that had to be fixed. So people took this Western idea of religion being a very narrowly defined thing, similar to Christianity, and everything else being superstition. So the vast majority of Chinese religious practice became redefined simply as superstition. So all of these little local temples that are hard to define exactly what faith they belong to, the city god temples, the temples to all kinds of local deities, historical personages, these were all defined as superstition and by and large destroyed. So what you were left with it was a very narrowly defined Buddhism, narrowly defined Taoism, and then of course you had Islam, Protestantism, and Catholicism, which coalesced out of the wreckage of this old system in the communist era. They became defined as the only five religions that could exist. So the vast majority of Chinese traditional practice, the sort of amorphous mixture of folk religion, Taoism, Buddhism, sort of all put together, this was simply verboten and gotten rid of. So this is why we go around Chinese cities and there's so little infrastructure of religious life. But what really struck me in researching this book is how people are trying to almost fix the damage of the past century. This idea that the past century was so traumatic, that China lost so much, that people want to make it whole again. Obviously, it's impossible, but this is a broader issue than simply religion. This is an issue of national identity. Who are we as Chinese people? What makes us Chinese? What do we believe in as a society? The old system destroyed. The effort to replace it with communism failed. Since then, the reform era, where the only defining principles are to get rich is glorious, make money, but don't ask too many questions about society and politics. That's of course, completely inadequate for any kind of society. And especially one like China, which for so many centuries, millennia, has been defined by shared values and shared ideas, such as those promoted by Confucius and other quasi-religious figures or philosophers. And I think this is why it's been this is why I see it as such a big issue. Chinese people, they look around society and they think that their society is lacking a moral compass. It's lacking some kind of shared values. Chinese people constantly talk about this lack of minimum moral standards in society. It's like there's no basement, there's no floor below which you won't go to get something done. So this is often mistranslated as bottom line in Chinese, di xian. But this is kind of a bad term because bottom line has the idea of sort of a business thing and making and profit. But what they really mean there is that there's a lack of a floor, sort of a minimum moral standards. And this is widely debated in Chinese society, in Chinese social media. It's not a topic that's taboo to talk about. You can, obviously it depends how you talk about it, but it's widely discussed. Every few months there's some example of some sort of egregious case of somebody who's injured or hurt on the street and nobody goes to help them. And then Chinese people talk about this and say, hey, what happened to our society? How did we get to this point where we don't even go help people in need, and so on. This is why people are turning to not just the formal organized religion, but I would define it more broadly as kind of a spiritual pursuit to change society. So in my book, I look at 5 players, 5 groups. I spent quite a while traveling around China trying to figure out which groups would be the most interesting to write about and the most representative, the most typical. I looked at one group of pilgrims, and I write all about their lives. These are the ones that are giving me liver sclerosis, and so these are working class people who have a pilgrimage that they go to and that they've rebuilt after it was destroyed in the Mao era. It's a wonderful temple complex outside of Beijing, Miaofengshan. And it's fascinating, actually. If you go on YouTube, you can find black and white videos shot in the 1920s of the pilgrimage to Miaoferngshan, shot by a guy named Sidney Gamble, who was a Western missionary, and he was head of the YMCA in Beijing at the time, and he was an amateur anthropologist. He's of the Procter and Gamble family. He was quite wealthy. He went to Beijing and shot all these images, black and white photos, and then he made a film, which is really worth seeing. All of these pictures, by the way, are at Duke University's digital archive and available also online. And so these pilgrims have tried to rebuild the pilgrimage to Miaoferngshan. And interestingly, they also use, because as I said, this idea of trying to fix all the damage. The temple was literally razed to the ground. It wasn't just damaged a little bit or somebody smashed in some windows or knocked over a wall. It was razed, and the foundation stones were tipped over the side of the hill down into the gully. So there was really nothing left in the 1980s and the early 1990s. So they went back to these old photos taken by Sidney Gamble to try to figure out what the temple exactly looked like, what the pilgrimage was like, how did people dress for the pilgrimage, what kind of clothes did they wear, what did they do there, what kind of performances did they put on. So that's one group that I talk about. Another group is a family in the countryside of Shanxi province in a little further west. It's a rural area. And this is a family of Taoist priests. And here we can see the countryside emptying out, people moving into the cities, and how traditional life in the countryside is changing, especially because of urbanization. And one of the more interesting groups, or maybe certainly in terms of fame in his religious community, probably the most impressive person I met was a pastor in southwestern China, in Chengdu. His name is Wang Yi. And Wang Yi is head of a reformed church in Chengdu that he founded. He was a very well-known human rights lawyer before converting to Christianity in 2005. And he's probably one of the most compelling public speakers I've heard. His sermons are sort of amazing. His church is socially engaged. They support homeless people. They support families of political prisoners. His sermons are edgy without becoming anti-government, and he has created almost an entire parallel system there with schools, seminaries, etc., and it's all unregistered. It's not part of the official church in China. It might be called underground or, now we're getting to the fun part of it, or an underground or house church. So he's the third strand. The fourth strand are people who meditate in caves a lot of the time, south of Beijing, south of Shanghai, in Zhejiang province. And these are people who I think represent, these are urban professionals, lawyers, doctors, architects. I spend a lot of time with all of them. They like to learn meditation practices, most of the time do this at home, but once a year go to this big retreat. There are about 500 people at the retreat. And this is again, and I think it's quite typical for religious life in China, it is not organized by the government. They're not part of a government structure. They just do this and they call it culture. They say, this is traditional Chinese culture. We're just meditating. It has nothing to do with religion. But they're meditating according to Taoist principles. They're doing it inside a gigantic temple with a statue of the great immortal Huang in front of them. Incense is going. There are Taoist priests. But they say, this is not religion. This is just culture. And I think this is a typical finding I found in this book, that the term religion is so fraught and so politically charged because of this past century of religion being this problem, this kind of taboo topic, that a lot of what happens in China now that is essentially religious in nature is simply called traditional Chinese culture. The exception there would, of course, be Christianity and Islam. But in all that other area, Taoism, Buddhism, folk religion, it simply is considered to be culture. And the fifth player, the fifth strand of this book, where I spent a bit of time, is the Chinese government. The Chinese government has, of course, we think it's a communist party. They must be opposed to religion. They're atheists. How could they support any kind of religious activity? This is true. The 85 million or so members of the Communist Party are all supposed to be atheists. But the party is no longer hostile to most religious practice in China. There are no-go areas, there are problem areas, and I can just basically tell you the clearest no-go area is any kind of foreign ties. It does not want foreign involvement in religion. Hence, Buddhism, fine, great, except when you talk about Tibetan Buddhism and the Dalai Lama. Islam, by and large, fine. Most Muslims in China don't suffer from great discrimination. However, the Muslims in Xinjiang who may have contacts overseas, that's a taboo topic, taboo area. Catholicism, obviously a problem because of the Vatican and Catholicism is sort of the original religion that has ties abroad. Protestantism, though, also. Protestantism, because many Protestant communities have overseas ties, especially to Chinese American Christian communities. They get some support, not really financial support, but they get some kind of know-how, knowledge, and information that's quite useful to them. And the government doesn't like that either. But those are all of those problem areas are united by the fact that they are foreign involvement. Most of the time in China, most religious activity is pretty much tolerated, if not, and increasingly in the past 5 years, outright encouraged by the government. And in fact, this picture is a good example. This is the temple fair at Miaofengshan outside of Beijing in the mountains, and way down there in the valley is Beijing. And this is supported by the government. It actually gets government subsidies to have the temple fair take place. So let me segue now into the government and just go a little bit more in depth, because we're in Washington. A lot of people are interested in it and sort of policy wonky type questions probably. So let me satisfy your burning desire to know what the political implications are. The answer is that all of this slightly predates Xi Jinping. I think sometimes we look at administrations, especially in China, and say it all started in 2012 or it started in whatever. But starting in the mid to late 2000s, around 2010, the government began to give some financial support to traditional culture and faith, but it really began to pick up under Xi Jinping. So let me just skip ahead for a second. This is the meditation in the caves that I mentioned outside of Beijing, outside of Shanghai. The blue light is not normally always on, but they turned it off shortly after that. So here's Xi Jinping. The place is the National Museum of, what is it called? The National Museum of China, right? Used to be the Revolutionary History Museum or something. And this is on Tiananmen Square. He went there in 2012 and declared that he was called for the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And the China Dream campaign was launched. Some people see this in purely nationalistic terms, and there's a heavy dose of nationalism involved in this also. But Xi began to support traditional values because people like this became not very credible. This is a soldier, Lei Feng, who was a model communist hero. And for many, many years, people like this were held up as the ideals, the communist ideals of selflessness and helping your neighbor, good neighborliness, almost like he was some kind of communist Christian guy, the do-gooder next door who helped old ladies cross the street and did this and that. People like that, very few people believe in these anymore. I mean, especially in the case of Lei Feng, most people who spend more than 60 seconds thinking about it realize that most of the story is BS, because the story is completely doctored. There was sort of miraculously wonderful photos like this when the guy was doing his good deeds. It's especially uncredible because he died as a young man when a telephone pole fell over and hit him on his head. So it wasn't like he was around until old age after people discovered him. It was kind of after he died, they sort of made a cult out of him. And voila, they had all of these fantastic photos, and his diary was written really in fantastic Chinese, even though he had a very limited education and so on and so forth. I remember talking to one guy in the book who said to me, after a while, if you think about this at all, maybe you don't think about it, you just read about Lei Feng in the high school textbook and you don't think too much. But if you do think about this, if this is an issue that concerns you, you realize the government's cheating me. The school textbooks are full of people like this, and they're not credible. So what is the government offering me? It's offering me essentially a pack of lies. And the government still has Lei Feng. You can see the guy with the hat, the sort of army hat. This is a billboard outside near my home in Beijing. They still have Lei Feng spirit, keep the Lei Feng spirit going, help your neighbors. And they have pictures of local do-gooders in the community who are doing good works and stuff like that. The government still sort of supports it, but it's really downplayed. You don't see too much of this anymore. It's almost perfunctory in front of a Communist Party office or something like that. Instead, Xi, right away in 2013, started to give signals that traditional culture, traditional values and ideas were okay. Not only okay, but that the government was going to support it. Here he is in Chufu in Shandong province, Confucius's hometown, and he's picking up a copy of the Analects of Confucius and saying something, I don't know the exact words, or something like, I can learn a lot from this guy. This guy's really great. Here he is meeting Xingyun, who's a very famous Buddhist master. He's from Taiwan. Part of the reason he meets him is because he wants to show ties between the mainland and Taiwan. This also gets into how religion can be a form of soft power for China. But he also is signaling that Buddhist leaders like this, who are patriotic, who are not in opposition to the Communist Party, are okay. In fact, I met Xingyun last year, and he told me about his meetings with Xi Jinping and how thanks to the government's support, they're rebuilding his master's temple in Jiangsu province, which is in the city of Yixing, and they have an incredible complex. The place I went to was just immense, all being supported by the government. The government gave the property, built roads out there, and so on and so forth, allows pilgrimages. I went there on October 1st, and there were thousands of people who were bussed in from neighboring villages, all to go on a pilgrimage. They were taught Buddhist ideas. They had a big Buddhist vegetarian meal together, and they were all given Buddhist sutras, and they were sent back home. And the government was perfectly okay with that. They think that this is the kind of thing that helps stabilize society, that helps create shared values. So Xingyun's he has some slogans, speak good words, do good deeds, have a good heart, or something like that, or have good thoughts in your heart. And the local Communist Party officials said, this is exactly what we need. We need people who are doing good deeds and saying good things, who are not negative, who are supporting society. And he's not in opposition to the government, so he's gotten government support. So I also, let me just keep that up there for a second. I also, I was fascinated as this was taking place. And I wondered who was behind some of these propaganda campaigns, because the propaganda campaigns make use of traditional images, symbolism, and rhetoric. So I got to know this guy, who is a Chinese blogger. His real name is Xie Luoqing, but he goes by the name of Yi Qing. And Yi Qing he started out as a nationalist blogger who contributed to books like China Can Say No, which was a big book in the 1990s, where it's basically like, we're standing up to the United States, and sort of copying the Japan Can Say No books of the 1980s, I think. And then he began to realize, probably because, I don't know if he's just paralleled the government or if he's an opportunist, I'm not really sure, probably a little bit of both, but he decided to start working in propaganda that had to do with spiritualism. So around 2011, so just before Xi took office, he went down to another province and he gives advice to governments on how to fashion effective propaganda campaigns. I know this because I've talked to him on several occasions, and he also has an incredibly active social media feed where he talks about all the places he's going and all the meetings he's had, and he takes tons of pictures and sends everything out to boast about, I went to Guizhou province and I talked to this governor, and here's a picture of me and the governor, and here's what we talked about, and here's the campaign we're doing, and all this kind of thing. And so he began to come up with ideas for the China Dream campaign. Let me just skip over that, that's not so important. Yeah, here I am, meeting him, great guy. He then began to think, what is something that all Chinese people kind of like? What's an image that everyone, kind of folk art that everyone likes or that everyone can relate to in China? He came up with these clay figures. This is a very popular Ni Renzhang. He's a folk artist outside of Beijing, outside of Tianjin, something similar to Norman Rockwell painting. It's something that a lot of people like. There's incredible knockoffs around China in almost every town, village, tourist center. There are these chubby kids. He saw that exact statue in one of the workmen's display cabinets. He'd been working on this for quite a while. And he saw that statue, and it was called, I think it was called, the workman who I've interviewed calls it Longing or something like that. There's a little girl, and you can see her arms around her knee, and her eyes are up dreamily looking up into the sky. And he thought, this is great, because what is she doing? She's thinking of the China Dream. And so there it is, sort of a close-up of it. And then they got busy. These guys don't just, they're very organized. They all had a big committee meeting. And so this was actually one of the China Dream campaign meetings. they all get together and hash this out. It's kind of like Mad Men, right? It's like the Communist Party sort of Mad Men brainstorming committee. Okay, here we've got this thing. What can we do with it? And what kind of slogans can we use? And how can we make this more attractive than the old Lei Feng communist propaganda campaign? They go through all this stuff. Here's some documents. It's incredible what you find on social media. And then they came up with these posters, which for a few years, if you've been to China, if you're in China even today, but especially after 2012, these posters were everywhere. And he boasted, we've got this 60,000 kilometer propaganda campaign. I was like, what is 60,000 kilometers? He said, that's how many public roads, miles of highways there are in China. The highways are going to be blanketed with this stuff. And sometimes it really felt like they were. It was a whole series of propaganda campaigns. It says the China dream, my dream. And this is a typical street thing. There she is again there. This was another statue that they found of people looking up into the sky, wistfully thinking. And this became also a propaganda poster. And here was an old couple that are using binoculars to look into the future. And this also became a poster. And this was even on workers' gymnasium in Beijing. It was the same thing. It was like you couldn't escape these posters. Subsequently, they've morphed, but they all have a few elements in common. Oh, actually, just as a strange, humorous aside, this is reality imitating art, imitating reality, or art. They decided they would find a girl who looked like the chubby little girl. So they found this young woman, actually. She's in her 20s. She's supposed to look like she's sort of 6 years old. They dressed her up like that. She said, okay, that's her. Then they got an artist to make a portrait of her, and they came up with this. And then they made some kind of mushroom sauce with her on it. Okay. What does this have to do with religion in China, right? That's the next question. But it's kind of amazing. So what does this have to do? The government uses these campaigns, though, to push traditional values. Here's an old-style one talking about the things have to do with Ren'ai, like this benevolence, uprightness, unity. These posters are found all around Beijing, pushing various, sometimes overtly government slogans, but also mixed in very cleverly with traditional ideas, cultural and quasi-religious concepts like filial piety. These are traditional ways of family raising ideas that was they had up on information boards in Beijing parks. Oh, I'm sorry, that didn't get. And this is, again, the cultural events the government has also began to support. The government very cleverly adopted this UNESCO term called Intangible Cultural Heritage. So this is meant to protect not tangible things like the Great Wall or the Forbidden City, but intangible things. And they can be simply something like cuisine or dance, but they also began to support rituals, religious music, and pilgrimages. So this pilgrimage to Miaofengshan gets a lot of government money, probably on the order of $100,000 US, which in China goes quite a long way, to put on this temple fair. And it has a very strong it is a temple, and it is a functioning temple, and people go there to worship. So these are some pictures of the temple fair, and you see this across the board. I'm in a little martial arts group that performs kind of like these guys do at the Miaofengshan Temple Fair. And when I got interested in it in about 2012, it was led by a very amiable bus driver who just taught kids at the local park near where he lived, taught them martial arts, this kind of stick fighting, and it was sort of discovered by the local party office, which said, well, this is great, this is exactly the kind of thing we need. They gave him some subsidies. He began to teach this in schools, So he got a gig. He's still driving a bus, but he has a gig once a week teaching PE class where he teaches them traditional stick fighting, which is not necessarily religious, but some of the kids in the PE class come to his normal sessions after school, and then they perform at the temple fairs. And the parents are often, I've seen this, I've been to many, many events with them, the parents are often really excited, especially when there's a temple fair. They all want to go, they all want to participate. And many of them, for the first time, are in a temple, lighting incense, and doing things like that. So the government, which is sometimes doing this overtly, I think, to support religion, for example, when Xi Jinping meets these Buddhist masters, but also in just supporting what it sees as traditional Chinese culture, it is promoting religious and spiritual ideas. And I believe this is overt and it's intentional. Now, this raises the maybe future-oriented question. I just conclude with a couple of quick remarks on that. What does this lead to in the future? In the previous couple of administrations, under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, religion was given a fair amount of laissez-faire, a fair amount of leeway. And religion grew quite quickly in the 90s and 2000s. I think under Xi Jinping, we see more of an effort to instrumentalize religion, to make use of it for government purposes. It's not as blatant as, say, in Russia, where Vladimir Putin portrays himself as the protector of the Orthodox Church, but Xi clearly is supporting some religions over others. There is much more support for the so-called traditional religions, Buddhism, Taoism, and this amorphous folk religion thing that's being promoted as culture. There's a lot less tolerance for some kinds of Islam in some parts of the country and Christianity, which I think they see as maybe even a bigger problem. I think for the party, Islam is a kind of problem, but it's more of a specific problem in one part of the country, in Xinjiang, because they feel there's a terrorism threat and they feel there's an overseas impact. Most Muslims in China are not in that part of the country, and most of them live without too much government interference in their life. But I think the Christians are, in a way, a bigger problem for the party because they're spreading in the Han majority. So, 92%, 91, 92% of China's population is Han, ethnic Chinese. And that's where Christianity is growing really, really quickly. So in some way, this is the first foreign religion that's been growing in China in centuries and centuries. And I think this is something that worries the government and where we can see perhaps in the future more conflict. But with that, I think I'll stop and we can move on to a bit of a discussion. Thank you.
Ian, that was fantastic and super interesting. And if you didn't see the copies of the book when you walked in, there are several they're outside, and you can pick up a copy. Ian will be here to sign copies after our discussion. Let me begin with a few questions and then throw it open to the audience. And I guess the first one is just how you got interested in religion in China. You arrived in China about the same time I did, when it would have been really hard to have come across churches and temples and things because of what you had described. So you'd really have to go looking for it, right? It just wouldn't just appear. So what was your sort of first encounter, and what drew you to stay engaged in following religious practice over your entire professional career?
Well, I thought it was, I felt religion was it was a topic that just personally interested me. When I went to China for the first time, I was simply curious, what do people here believe? And growing up, we went to church and Sunday school, and I knew that there were religions in China, but when I went there in the 1980s, it seemed more like a historical phenomenon. If there were any books in bookstores, they were often filed under philosophy or Oriental mysticism or something like that, and they were these classics that had existed, the Tao Te Ching or Confucius's Analects or the Buddhist sutras. I was just curious what was left. And so I went to a few temples, and at that time it seemed like it was really dead. It only changed to me when I went back in the 1990s, and China was in the midst of a huge uprising or a growth of this spiritual practice called Qigong, which is a kind of meditative physical practice, somewhat similar. You can think of it like yoga in a way, but more meditating, more breathing. And it began to be clear that, well, something was really up, because these people were, they weren't just doing a physical practice for health, they were also getting from their masters books that had moral precepts, guidelines to good living, clean living, and you could see that people were looking for something. So that's when it became obvious.
Terrific. I should mention that Ian's the risk taker in another way. He rides a bike in China, in cities. And so he's willing to take a lot of risks that most of us won't. We'll now go in a taxi cab and put our lives in the hand of someone who's barely driven more than a few weeks. So he's probably smarter than the tiny taxi than us. Let me ask something else about this, about religion in China. When I think of China, I kind of think of three countries. One is the wealthy China, the high-tech China, the tall buildings that replace the temples. I think of the fast-moving country that people think's eating, that's eating our lunch that people talk about. Then I think about Rust Belt, state-owned enterprises, maybe mostly in the Northeast, but even in Hebei. And then I think about rural China, much of which has been left behind, tried to catch up by sending families to Shenzhen or other places to work in factories, but have gone back as exports have slowed. So is religion, would you describe it as being practiced or believed or lived differently in these Chinas, or how would you divide how religion is practiced across the country?
Well, I think it's different in different social groups. Sometimes we think of religion or people who view it from a sociological point of view, or they maybe think, well, religion must be, or the communists often think like this is the way the Communist Party often thinks of religion as a salve for people who have problems. And so it must be that religious practitioners in China are the unemployed in the Rust Belt or the poor farmers who aren't making any money. But actually I find it's growing almost, and it's hard to have exact numbers because there's no real survey work, but it's certainly growing at least as fast among the prosperous people. There was one pastor I interviewed, and she said to me, we used to think we were unhappy because we're poor, and now we're rich, but we're still unhappy. So this is sort of a phenomenon you see around the world, this idea that money alone doesn't bring happiness, and there have to be some other values in society besides prosperity and economic growth. And I think that you see it all over, in the big cities, the white-collar class, a lot of young people are attracted to Protestant churches, for example. I think that's quite a typical phenomenon, but other groups as well.
Let me just push on this a little bit further. And I think one of the general framework oftentimes that folks in the United States use to think about religion in China is just about religious liberty, right? And whether or not you can practice without paying much attention to the substance of what is being practiced. And you write a lot about that in the book. And I think one of the questions that I've always had is, if folks in China had the ability to practice their religion fully as they wanted to with no outside interference, what kind of society would China be? Would it be a secular society where there's religious practice in your private life, but a modern, government and public life that's separate to that? Or would you see sort of orthodox religious practice seep more into public life? How do you think the lines would be drawn?
Yeah, I think one of the freedom to practice is one issue. There's also a lot of issues that a lot of communities face that sound kind of dull in a way, but they're actually quite profound. And it's how these groups are organized. And a lot of them reflect bigger problems in society. Churches, whether it's a church or a temple, they're often run in an authoritarian manner without much transparency. And this is a big problem that people talk about a lot in religious communities. And so the freedom to practice is one issue, but I think it's also how society is organized and what kind of role models people have when they start an organization, because people start organizations in a context and they see how other things are run, and so they kind of imitate these things. And this is one of the bigger issues. Sometimes the corruption or the sort of one-man rule of churches. Some of the churches are run by very charismatic people. It's the same with these pilgrimage groups. They're often, one person runs it, and that's it. They're often very patriarchal. People often remark on the churches in China that this is not unique to China, but it's quite pronounced in China that, 2/3 or well over half of the people in the congregations are female, but the pastors are almost all male. And this is really the case in the congregation that I profile in this book, where they expelled a couple the wife had studied theology and thought that women should be able to be ordained and maybe have some kind of a role in the church, at least as a lay leader. And the couple was expelled from the church, and the pastor said that she was bringing Satan into the church. So it's quite. I think those kind of issues are actually almost more important than the freedom to practice, because except for certain cases that we read about and that I've written about as a journalist, and it's not unimportant, the persecution issues, but overall, the number of believers is growing quickly.
Yes.
So, and the number of churches and people in churches is growing. Not the physical buildings. Building a church with a steeple and stained glass and all that's difficult, but starting a small religious community that you can meet, you meet in an office building, meet in someone's home, those are growing rapidly around China.
Okay, let me ask one last question, and then open it up to everyone else. One group that you didn't bring up but alluded to, I want to ask about the Catholic Church, because I was shocked to read that negotiations between Beijing and the Holy See have progressed much further than at any time in the past, and that they might come to some type of accommodation. Given what you said about the concern about Christianity and an organization, putting on your journalist hat as well, in addition to what you've done, where do you think those conversations are going? Could they eventually come to some type of agreement?
Yeah, I was surprised by that also. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have thought that it would be almost impossible for the Catholic Church and Beijing to reach an agreement. I don't have any inside knowledge. I still find it incredible, because the key point is who names the bishops. This is something that, for sure, especially under Xi Jinping, Beijing will not yield control of that. And if they don't, then I don't know how the Vatican could accept a deal, because I'm sure they want to name the bishops. Naming the clergy, the senior clergy members, is one of the most important issues. There was a modus vivendi that about 10 years ago, where there were sort of 3 names were put forward by one side, and the other side might say, well, I can't live with that person, but I can live with those 2 people, and then the other side got to pick one of those 2. So it gave face sort of to both sides. If there was somebody really egregious, you could rule them out. Maybe they could go back to something like that, an informal structure. But I think I see it as very difficult. It's going to be hard also for them to sell it, because the people who have been in the underground Catholic Church, who for nearly 70 years have put up with this, trying to be loyal to the Vatican, they're going to feel sold out. I mean, it's going to be really hard to sell this to people in the underground church. But I'm not exactly sure what motivates Rome. I sometimes wonder if it isn't that they feel that the Catholic Church has almost been left behind by this religious boom. Mm-hmm. The number of Catholics in China is small, and I would say it's the smallest of the 5 religions. And its population, or the number of believers has just tracked China's population growth over the past 60 or 70 years. as opposed to say, the numbers just very quickly, in 1949 there were roughly 3 million Catholics, 1 million Protestants. Now there are roughly 10 to, at the uppermost, 12 million Catholics and 50 to 60 million Protestants. So clearly the Catholic Church hasn't kept up with the Protestants. It's lost, and to the other religions also. So people are not converting to Catholicism. They just convert maybe if they marry into a Catholic family. But I gotta think that's maybe a reason why the Catholic Church wants to sort of fix this problem. If they could fix the relations to the Vatican, then perhaps they can grow again.
Yeah. So it would be like on many other topics where Beijing now has leverage that they didn't have before. So not just folks in technology, but folks in the religion business. So okay, I'm going to take questions. Please identify yourself and ask a question. So we'll start right here with the gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much for your
and here's a microphone. I'm sorry, that was the third
Thank
point.
you for your wonderful presentation. I'm Kurti, and I have two brief questions. One is, as you mentioned, the rise of Christianity in the last few decades in China. So how would you equate rise of Christianity with the notion of Christianity is normally associated with white and West, despite the fact that there's entire West rhetoric across China, particularly promoted by government media, but still China's society is very much obsessed with fairness, white, like Western values and stuff like that. So how would you equate spirit of Christianity with the whiteness attached with it? My first question. Yeah, foreign or Western stuff. First question. Right. My second question is, you mentioned religion, particularly traditional religion like Buddhism and stuff like that, as one medicine that cures many diseases. Like you mentioned the role of religion as a promotion of self-power. At the same time, legitimization of communist power, consolidation of communist power. Then you mentioned about the recover of ethical and moral value in society. So in which direction government emphasize more, either to promote soft power or to promote it to recover ethical and moral values in society, or more like consolidated power, or at the same time, three of those are going at the same time in China?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So in terms of Christianity being seen as a foreign religion or a white religion or an outsider religion, yeah, I think there are many people who view that, who think that, especially in the party. They will see China as see Christianity as a foreign religion. I know many people in this martial arts group that I'm in, for example, this pilgrimage group. They think of Christianity as a foreign religion and sort of incompatible with traditional Chinese culture. And I often think that people who reject Christianity and who prefer other religions, it's because they want to keep traditional Chinese holidays and festivities, tomb sweeping, respect for ancestors. Sometimes it's hard to do that and to be considered a Christian. So I think it is a challenge for many people. This is maybe one reason why they don't accept Christianity. And then in terms of your second question, soft power versus consolidating power, I don't think it's a conflict. I think the government thinks that it helps create values and some sort of moral foundation in society, consolidates society a bit. And it also, as a bonus, helps overseas. In the Chinese city of Wuxi, in Jiangsu province, for example, they set up a permanent headquarters for the World Buddhist Association. This is sort of a global organization. China is the world's largest Buddhist nation now, so this helps in relation to Southeast Asian nations, even though they're different kinds of Buddhism, but still relations to Thailand. It's also even interesting for Indian people that Chinese go to India as religious tourists to see where the Buddha was born and achieved enlightenment. That gives a different image of Chinese people than simply people who are going to buy cheap stuff or whatever. So,
okay, we're going to the gentleman here, and then we'll come over here.
Hi, I'm John Freeman. I'm a professor of religious studies at George Mason. So you talked about how governments adapt. Well, religions adapt also. And I'm interested to know some examples of how you see religions adapting internally to the new situations. I mean, in terms of their self-understanding, their doctrines, their rituals, their language, their structures. Thank you.
Okay. I'll give you one example that I found really interesting, and it's a book you're probably familiar with. It's by Henrietta Harrison. It's this book called The Missionary's Curse, which talks about life in a Catholic Chinese village. And the point that she makes in this book is that Catholicism changed in China over the centuries to become more in line with global Catholicism. It started out maybe more indigenous and moved to become more part of the global Catholic Church. And I found this in the group that I looked at, this Protestant church. They started out as just a typical house church with just a dozen people meeting in somebody's living room. But then as they got bigger and bigger, they began to try to figure out where they fit into the global church. Most Chinese still today will say, well, we don't have denominations in China, we're just Protestants. There is no such thing as denominations. It's not really true, but that's how many people think of it. But more and more churches are trying to consciously adopt denominations. So one area where they changed was to insist on infant baptisms. I would say overwhelmingly, most Chinese Protestants don't believe that infants should be baptized. They believe this is something an adult should do. An adult decides whether he or she is a Christian, and then an adult is baptized. Children don't have that ability to make the decision on free will, so they shouldn't be baptized. But this church decided we are going to become Calvinists. And Calvinism requires infant baptism. So they had a big discussion in the church, and everyone argued and fought about it for several months, and finally they just agreed on it, and they tacked these rules and regulations up in the back of the church, said they followed the Westminster Convention, and et cetera, and listed all the principles, and if you're in the church, you have to support infant baptism. So I think but the bigger issue, which is interesting, rather than that narrow thing, is just how people are plugged into the global world. Not just in terms of pop culture and things like that, but in terms of religion.
We're going to come to this woman right here. Just wait for the microphone.
Hi there. My name is Sophie Jin, and I work for the CCC, and I specialize in freedom of religion, so very pertinent. And I had two questions, one of which I guess you're sort of touching on already, but how in the Chinese Christian church are folks working through the idea of foreignness? And my mother, for example, grew up in China as a Chinese Christian, and I think she actually, even herself being Christian, actually did identify a little bit with the foreignness, and I think for her, she felt like it sort of lent her life a sort of cultural sophistication that maybe other people around her didn't have. So I'm wondering what kinds of, how you see that a kind of discourse working its way through the church in Chengdu, or elsewhere, I guess, if there were other Christian communities that you worked in. And then the other question I had was about, you mentioned about the parents being very excited to go to the temples because their children were performing there. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what it was they said that they were excited about going to do at the temples that maybe they hadn't been before.
So the first part of the question is how foreignness is...
Yeah, how do people in the Chinese Christian churches talk about this perception of being foreign within China?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think the first question is really interesting. There's a guy who was active in the 1989 Tiananmen protests, and he had helped make this television show called River Elegy, and this is a very important television multi-part documentary that sort of said China should be more outward looking, and many of the protesters in 1989 had watched it and were influenced by this. And after the protests were crushed, he fled abroad, he converted to Christianity, and he began to turn his powers to telling the story of Christianity in China. And he made this multi-part documentary film on Christianity, showing that it came to China as early as the Tang Dynasty. The Nestorians first came. This is all historically completely proven. There are steles and historical artifacts that show that Nestorian Christians came to China in like the 8th century. They didn't stay permanently, but they came as traders and so on. And then, you know, he recounts the whole story and how people came again in the 1200s or so in the Yuan dynasty, and then came to stay in the Ming dynasty as the Jesuits. And this was sort of a permanent Christian presence. And points out that, of course, there's been a permanent Christian presence in China for over 400 years. And the point is to show that it is not a foreign religion. Of course, Buddhism has a longer history, but it's in a way, you know, it's foreign also. It came from India, and it's been in China for a long time, and it's not considered foreign. So why should Christianity be considered foreign? And this Nestorian story, this stele, it's an enormous stone tablet, sort of, you know, goes up almost to the top of these, you know, 4 or 5 of these things here. It's been duplicated and it's recarved, original full size, and erected in different parts of China by Christian communities to sort of show, look, here we are in the Tang Dynasty, the sort of the high point of Chinese civilization, and we were there. We were part of it. And I think that's part of this. That's part of the way that they deal with it. And the second part, what interests them when they go to the temples, I think part of it is because, as I was saying at the beginning, this destruction of religious infrastructure, the lack of temples in Chinese cities, especially in Beijing, which is maybe the most, where the destruction was perhaps carried out the most, it means it's sometimes hard for people to go to temples. They just haven't had that experience. There aren't temples in all the neighborhoods in Beijing. So you get the chance to go in there as an insider at a big, exciting Runao temple fair. For people are fascinated and they want to know about it. And you always see scenes of people who are like, okay, so how do I hold the incense? And then how do I kowtow? And how many times do I do it? And where do I stick the incense sticks in the sand in the censer? I mean, you just see that constantly being repeated during the temple fairs over and over again. So I think people are genuinely curious about it.
I wanted to ask one question about where Chinese leaders engage religion. You talked about sort of their policies, and you know, it'd be nice if we could figure out which Politburo member is a Christian, which is a Buddhist, who's a Taoist, and things like that. But that probably going to be a little bit hard. It's going to take more legwork. But one area where I see Chinese leaders participating in what might be deemed religion are in funeral rites. So I'll give you an example. Hu Yaobang's wife, Hu Yaobang being a very important 1980s Chinese leader, his wife just passed away. And almost every single Chinese leader went to pay their respects. And they sent flowers and there was incense. Is that, I don't think it was in a temple, it may have been, but would it have carried connotations that were beyond just culture that you would interpret saying that there's religious significance to the way they're doing that? Other senior leaders, the current leaders have gone and visited their graves. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's safe once the other leaders have passed away to practice be involved. I don't know. I'm just wondering if there's something there.
Yeah, I mean the first point you made about joking about which Politburo members are this. Yeah. I'm sure that no members of the Politburo are religious. I think who knows privately what people do. There's often a lot of speculation that it's often about the wives. Xi Jinping's wife is a closet Buddhist, and before it was Jiang Zemin's wife was a closet Buddhist. And I think it's this desire to think that your leaders are religious or somehow practicing.
And I heard Li Peng's wife practiced Falun Gong or something like that, you know.
I'm not sure this stuff is doubtful, but who knows,
yes,
right?
Okay.
The funeral rites, this was something that the communists picked up on early. I have a section in my book on on Qingming, on the Tomb Sweeping Festival, which just took place in early April, and how this is something that is now a national holiday in China. But earlier in the 50s and 60s, it was called, I think it was called National Martyrs' Day. So Qingming was renamed National Martyrs' Day. Mao Zedong wrote a famous essay commemorating a former guard of his, I think his name was Zhang Sidi, who died, and then he wrote this famous essay saying, all men die, but some men's death is light as a feather, in other words, inconsequential, and other men's death is as heavy as Mount Tai. And to die for the fascists and landlords is inconsequential, as light as a feather, but to die for the masses is as heavy as Mount Tai. And this sort of started this cult of the Red Martyr that you see, all these people being pushed, like Lei Feng and others, who died for the cause. And on Qingming, they go to the Babaoshan Revolutionary Martyrs Cemetery and lay wreaths and do this sort of thing. Of course, they would say, the party officials would definitely say, this is not religion, this is simply respect. And this is simply traditional Chinese cultural practices. But I think many people might see it as a kind of quasi-spiritual.
Okay, let's come over here. Right in front, and then we'll go to the next. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, right in front. Yes, this gentleman.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. I'm Satoshi Nishihata. I graduated from the Columbia University CIPA this year. And I have two quick questions. There were some groups at universities who are presenting the tragic crackdown on the Falun Gong. I don't know the exact Falun Gong.
Falun Gong?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is. So I'm curious about the current situation of Falun Gong in China. And second question is, what is your prospect about the future of Chinese politics if the trend of growing population of religion keeps going on? So what do you think will happen to Chinese political system? Thank you.
Thanks, yeah. In terms of Falun Gong, my feeling is that there are very few practitioners left in China. There was a report by Freedom House. This is a New York-based advocacy group that does research into religion and other issues of freedom in China. And they argued that there are 23 million Falun Gong followers in China. That seems to me high. I don't feel like I really encounter that. Sometimes people say, well, maybe there's still some aunt or grandma who practices it at home. But it's very hard for me to know. I tend to feel that in China, it's not very strong. It's more present, as we know, abroad. In the United States and other countries, there's Falun Gong newspaper, Epoch Times. There's a Falun Gong television station, New Tang Dynasty Television. So it's quite active in foreign countries. And of course, protesting in front of embassies and consulates around the world. But inside China, I feel like it's quite small. What's the future? That's a great question. I wish we could all answer that. It seems to me that religion is part of a broader trend of Chinese society becoming more complex and harder to manage. I don't mean that China is becoming chaotic, but that it's hard for the government to try to manage all aspects of Chinese society, because people are getting wealthier, they're becoming better educated, they're interested in things like religion, they're also interested in other pursuits. Religion is a bit different than, say, being interested in a pure hobby, let's say, because it gives this idea of moral values that are higher than any particular government platform or program. So I think in China especially, it gives this idea of righteousness, of justice, in China, the idea of heaven, tian, is very important. And this is something that traditional values and religions support that. It sort of makes it harder for the government to be seen as giving people rights, giving people justice. People maybe want to demand it because they feel it's their divine right. So I think in the long run, it can have that kind of an impact. But it's not like China is communist-era Poland with a Catholic Church that's about to help overthrow the party. It's not in that level of.
I think you just described John Locke. We're going to come to Anne right here in the third row.
Hi, my name is Ann Thurston, and I teach at the China Studies program at SAIS. And thank you, Ian, for this and for all of the work that you've done. I love what you do. And I also teach in my courses at SAIS about religion in China. But if I were thinking about how to revive the Chinese tradition and Chinese traditional values, I would think first of Confucianism and later of religion. So I would wonder, and I would also argue, I think that there is a revival of Confucianism going on in China today. We in the West have been writing about it, some very interesting work. So I would wonder how you would see Confucianism in side by side with this new religious revival.
Yeah, I would say, of course, this is a debate among scholars. Is Confucianism, or was Confucianism a religion? And there's certainly people like Du Weiming who would argue that it was definitely a religion. And there are, almost every Chinese city had Confucian temples. And Confucius, of course, said that the world of spirits and something is sort of beyond my pay grade. I don't think about that. And he just was offering practical advice. But it became, I think it's a form of values that is very close to some kind of religious or spiritual. I mean, it's certainly more than just, the role of Confucius in traditional society was more than just, say, John Locke or Plato or somebody whose books you read and adopted or not. I mean, it was a very solemn, holy thing that people followed. So Confucianism and Confucian ethics are part of this overall macro trend. I think of it as a spectrum. You can have some things that are just called culture, Confucianism, spiritual traditional practices, and then the really formal, hierarchically organized religion that follows the Western norm of religion. So you got to have a special place, a clergy, you've got to have a holy book, you've got to do things on a certain day of the week. That's a Christian normative definition of religion. But in traditional China, religion was part of daily life, and it was something much broader, this idea of it being infused in life in traditional China. And actually, in most traditional societies, it was probably like that. And the Abrahamic religions are a bit different for having been so organized and so on. Anyways, but yeah, I think it's part of the same phenomenon. Yeah.
Terrific. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. This woman in the fourth row, second chair.
Hi, Ian. It was great to hear your presentation. When I first heard that you were writing a book about religion last year, I was really excited for it to come out. Glad to have my own copy now.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, yes. I'm Bethany Allen Abrahamian. I write for Foreign Policy magazine. I cover China. I have a question about authenticity. So I lived in Xiamen for several years, right next to Nanputuosi, the monastery there, and the reputation that the monks had there. I mean, it was a very sort of lively temple, lots going on, but the reputation that the monks had there was that they were kind of not really monks. Like, you talk to Chinese people about them, and they'd say, oh yeah, they have mistresses on the side, they try to get money. So that's one kind of issue. And then another one, so in the Pearl River Delta, there's also, as you've described, some people trying to bring back an old festival that was stamped out, during the Cultural Revolution, but didn't really know how to do it. So they, got Peking opera costumes and, sort of didn't, like, it was kind of hollow, like they were trying to bring it back but didn't quite know what they were doing. I just wanted to ask if you witnessed that kind of thing amidst this revival, and if you think that that's kind of just a transitionary stage as people move towards, new traditions and amidst old ones, or if you have any other comments on that.
Sure. No, the first point is interesting on commercialism. This is a big problem in Chinese religion, especially in the traditional religions. I say exclusively in the traditional religions, and here I mean Taoism, Buddhism, not Confucianism, but folk religions. Many local officials see temples as a way to make money, so they have admission fees, sometimes quite high. Often this is not what the local religious authorities want, because they don't get much of that money. There's many temples, for example, will charge up to 100 yuan to get into the temple, but 90% of that or more, or even all of it, goes to some local tourism board that's run by the local government, and the actual temples almost get no money. And this has been widely remarked upon. And then what happens, often the clergy there, in this case, say the monks, start to engage in commercial activities because they need to get money. So they will do a lot of fortune telling or helping people out in advising people in businesses and so on and so forth. Financing is a real issue. Many of these big monasteries traditionally had land holdings, and those were all taken away after 1949 as part of land reform. So they were stripped of their ability to raise money. And then this sort of new commercial thing comes in of selling tickets to people, but the temples don't really get the money for that. So it's still a big issue. The government and people talk about this a lot, about trying how to fix that problem. The people in the temples overwhelmingly don't want admission fees, because if you don't have an admission fee, local people will think your temple is more authentic, it's more efficacious, and they'll give money. So there are so many examples of this where, if you want to go and pray for something, people prefer to pray at a temple that doesn't have an admission fee. For one thing, it doesn't cost you money to get into the temple, but also it feels more real and authentic. And then if they feel it's useful, they'll give money, they'll donate money. And you can see this in many temples around China, that huge amounts of money are donated by business people and so on if they feel that the temple has helped them. So the clergy would prefer not to have the admission fee, but this is a real issue. Second question of authenticity is also interesting. I think people want to have authenticity. They want to go back, almost to fix this disaster, to go back and somehow go back to the way it was in the past. It reminds me a bit of the big shopping street in Beijing, Tiananmen Street, which was just south of Tiananmen Square. It runs perpendicular up into Tiananmen Square. And about 10 years ago, they decided they were going to rebuild it, but they weren't sure what Tiananmen Street were they going to rebuild, because Tiananmen Street's been around for hundreds of years, and it was kind of dilapidated, and there were a lot of new buildings that were attached to it. So they decided that the high point of Tiananmen was 1920. So they said, okay, we're going to rebuild Tiananmen in the 1920 style. So they put in some little streetcar that looks like a 1920 style streetcar, and they had these buildings and these stores and that stores. Many people want to go back, but they can't, and so they're trying to find things that work for them. So there is a lot of experimentation going on now.
Ian, this has just been a fantastic discussion. Congratulations on the book. I've learned a lot, and I know everyone else has. And of course, Ian's going to be around afterward for you to continue the conversation and let him sign copies of the book that you all get. When I first started working on China, and you did too, religion definitely wasn't widely practiced. And when you think about Chinese soft power, you certainly didn't necessarily think of religion. You thought of it as the weak underbelly of China because of the lack of values. And I wonder if in reading your book, it makes me think about, surprisingly enough, Hegel and dialectics, and sort of starting to the thesis, antithesis, and now maybe we're getting toward the synthesis of sort of religion trying to find its place and maybe peace in a contemporary China, which we wouldn't have expected. But I think the other thing is just what the variety is and what you describe, and but not just local varieties, but how China is engaging globally religion. and because religion is always evolving, and China's religion in China is part of that global story, which you've told so wonderfully. Everyone, please join me in thanking Ian Johnson.